So hi, I'm Reid Burke, and I've been on the YUI team for a little over 2 years, and I spent a lot of time working on testing. So this talk is about writing code that works, but before I get into exactly what that means, this talk is mostly about testing software. So when you think about what the purpose of testing, though, I think the title, instead of calling having the title of this talk be something about Yeti or be something about testing software, I thought it would make more sense for what testing is actually all about. And to that end, I work, this is actually the alternate title that I was also considering, besides calling it something about Yeti, was when not to write tests. Because, as I'm going to explain later, I think testing is something that is a tool, and I'll get to explain more about that. But it's a tool because your time is limited, and that's something to think about through the rest of this talk, is that I'm going to talk about tools. I'm going to talk about, for folks, if you're new to testing or if you're already using tests as a part of your development strategy, for ways to improve that and to continue doing that. But all this stuff is all supposed to help you write better software. And it's supposed to help you make the best use of your time because it is limited. And I'll get to explain more about that in this talk. But mostly what I've been doing for the last year is writing and improving Yeti. And so Yeti is something that we use at YUI to test it before we release it. And this is a project that's been very old. In fact, I talked about this 2 YUIConfs ago, back when it was a much simpler tool. And I'll get to show you how it's changed in the last 2 years. And the different things that we're hoping to do now with Yeti that we wasn't really a part of it when I first wrote it. And also an appeal for if this kind of thing excites you, then for how you can help and help make it better. But the whole point of Yeti, if you're not familiar, is it's very simple. It's simply to test JavaScript with any browser. And so it's not for testing JavaScript on the server or testing like server-side JavaScript. It's made so that, or it's not even for testing JavaScript-powered apps, which are actually pretty neat. If you've ever used Windows 8, or if you're ever familiar with kind of how either writing an app like that or writing an app with Appcelerator or any of the kind of hybrid kind of technologies that allow you to take JavaScript and write it into an application, that's pretty neat. But what this is kind of for is just for web applications. And it's trying to do that one thing really well. And it's trying to do it in a way that isn't quite like the other stuff that we found that was available for us for testing, including what we were using before. And so the biggest thing that's different from what we were using before was Selenium, was that it required a driver. And what that basically is say if you wanted to test something on your computer, then you would have to have a program that would automate that browser. So you would need another program, the Selenium driver or web driver, to open up a browser and to then basically open the test that you want to do and then collect the results and then move on to the next test. And this is all kind of done outside of the browser instead of inside of the browser. And so something that's problematic is for testing devices, right? So we have all these devices, and if we wanted to write a driver, that's possible, but we didn't think that was the best approach, and I'll get to explain that in a little bit. So basically, all the things that we want to do with Yeti, as opposed to Selenium, is possible, and that's why we chose to do it. We also chose to do it, or I chose to do it with Node. And Node makes this very easy for me to do, and I'm hoping that it makes it easy for you, the users of Yeti, because it's what all of our YUI tools for the last year or so have all been built on top of Node, which is very easy to install nowadays on the 3 major platforms, desktop computing platforms. So you just get an installer, and then you're good to go with a command line tool that easily lets you install all of YUI's build tools, including Yeti, if you choose to use it by itself. Of course, the big thing about Yeti is that it's trying to do one thing well, and that's in contrast to something like Yogi, right, which is supposed to be the interface that's consistent that lets you build YUI applications. And Yeti is a part of Yogi. So if the things that I'm talking about this are just a part of what we're doing with our YUI tools, right? And if you're using Yogi, you get to benefit from a lot of this as a YUI contributor, which is pretty neat. Node's also just really well suited for orchestrating the interaction between all these different devices that we have, which I'll get to explain more about later. So how we use this is for, right now we use it before releases. Historically, we've used it to test while we're in development, and I'll get to show that to you in just a minute. And what we're hoping to do in the future is actually to have this a part of our CI system. And this is a very ambitious thing. It's something that I'm working on. What the bulk of my work until the end of the year is going to be on is getting this a part of what we do to test YUI in an automated way. And so I'll show you some of the progress that we made towards that. And to reiterate some things about Selenium, kind of the really big things that we've been focusing on is testing on real devices. So when you think about how with Selenium you have on the iOS at least, there's people have wrote these web kind of these drivers that are iPhone apps, and so you as an organization can take the WebDriver iOS app from the WebDriver project or the Selenium project, and you can throw that, if you have a developer account that costs $100, you can then throw that on an iPhone. And so now my iPhone, it now has, say, this app that I can launch, like WebDriver, and I can launch that, and then I could say, connect this to my WebDriver hub or my WebDriver server, and then it can listen for tests and then run them on this device, right? And so that seems okay, but then you can also do that for Android too, so that's an option. So most of these devices are covered. But when it comes to this guy, this Surface, like you're kind of screwed. Like there's no driver for it yet. And what we want to do is to make sure, even if we're not supporting each environment, we want to make sure that we can test it on each environment to understand and have our people who use the library, even if it's not something that we support, for them to understand how their code works. On whatever they decide to support, right? That's a really big push in recent history for YUI, is that we're encouraging for folks to test on different devices, not necessarily to have the same experience on a lot of different devices. So it's really good for us to understand, even if this isn't on our supported devices list yet, with every release, are we introducing regressions? What kind of problems are we seeing with devices like these? So we don't want to have to write any more code than we have to. And it turns out with Selenium, a lot of times the kinds of things that we care about for automating tests are just a very small subset of what Selenium does. Selenium can take screenshots. It can manipulate form controls. The only thing we care about is getting the test results from a test. That's pretty much it. It turns out you can do all that in the browser. So we're using the actual browser. And so that's kind of a pain point for this guy. So if you are writing an iOS app that is automating with Selenium, the problem with that is you're using a UI web view. And UI web views are great. You should be testing on them too. The problem is that it's not exactly the same as, and you're not going to get the same results as Safari. It's using, for security reasons, it uses a different way of running JavaScript. It actually is using a different engine. So that's something to keep in mind, and something that we wanted to just eliminate altogether by running on the actual browsers that folks are using, and not something that is just built on top of WebKit or something that's an approximation of it. This is to complement, by the way, what we do already with Grover and with Phantom.js. Those things are really great for smoke testing, and it's something that makes it really easy for you without doing any setup at all. Like this, I think, is pretty easy, and I'll get to show that. But that still is something that we use when we're iterating, working on things, and even testing in Travis. But our ultimate goal is to provide things like this where we actually don't need that, or this gets so good that we can test on real devices instead of having to use something that's a little bit faster but isn't what our users actually use. So I present to you the Dave Glass Device Laboratory of Southern Illinois. This is our QA lab. So I think I have this iPad and this iPhone, but everything else, and this isn't even all the things that Dave has. But when I was looking at Yeti and really working on Yeti earlier this year, I was thinking about how like a lot of the people on our team, even though we don't have we can't buy tons of devices, like most folks on our team do have these devices, and most people in the community have devices like this. And so if I could make a tool that would make it easy for folks to contribute these devices, and to just if all you need to do is spend like a couple minutes setting up the device to never sleep, and then go and just have it idle on a website, that would be really neat. So that's like kind of a really big long-term goal that I would like to have for Yeti. Shorter term though, what we had was Dave had all these devices, and he's in Southern Illinois. We work from the communities everywhere, and we're kind of, some of us are in Sunnyvale, but there's some of us that are all over the place. But we wanted to be able to use these devices on our computers and have it kind of work like magic. And so that's kind of what Yeti will get us to do. And without talking too much about it, I'd like to present some of this stuff to you. So what I have here is all these devices. They are all connected through a Wi-Fi network to this computer. This computer is running a Yeti server. All I had to do is yeti -server. If you're trying to install Yeti, that's something you do with npm install Yeti. You get the Yeti command line, start a server, then it gives me two helpful URLs. So one of them is something that I can put that shows up for just convenience, like I can launch a browser from just by going to localhost and then open selection. So that makes it handy for starting stuff on my local machine. But here I have it as a local area network of devices, and then this could ultimately be passed through. You could put a hole through your firewall and then get all this stuff on your on the public internet as well, and that's what's at hub.daveglass.com. So and kind of the unofficial thing that you see inside of Yeti. So when Dave was trying to use that too, it turns out like Yeti, in order to use it, requires WebSockets right now. We're actually, the YUIConf network is behind a proxy that strips the upgrade header of HTTP requests, which is kind of unfortunate. But that's something that we can definitely improve on. So we have this Yeti-server, and let's see. So now you're pretty much able to run tests. So if I wanted to run something, say like widgets test, then I can just run Yeti, and that command is actually all that I needed to do. So what it's doing right now is there's 7 tests inside of this component. You could see that it's, I wanted to make it as big as possible for you to see, but it shows all the different browsers that are connected. And some of them you see are duplicates. So like right in the middle of the screen, you'll see agent connected Safari 6.0 twice. But what's actually happening is that when you connect 2 of the same browser together, they can share the load. So what's happening is that this device is iOS 6, Safari 6, and then so is the iPad over there. And so what happened is they had 7 HTML files to run, and each of them one of them ran 3 and the other one ran 4, so that's pretty neat. And so we have in 15 seconds across all these devices, I know what my component is like, and I can do this with any component I'd like. So this one's just one, so that will be pretty simple, and you can see all them work. So while that's happening, I'm going to go and show you what some of this stuff looks like for you in the back. So yeah, like it's just basically like you could see that you could see that changing. Hopefully, this is an app framework test, so it's going through everything. You can see there's a failure up there, and now it's returning the capture page. So if I go back over here. And let's see. I'm sorry. Oh yeah, everybody, Dave. So yeah. So up here you could see the failure that you saw on the Windows 8 tablet is showing up on here. So that's pretty neat. And this ran 2,130 tests. So I'll run it again because Dave's standing there now. And so let me switch over to the Yeti TV. So what's happening here is basically this stuff is getting served from the Node.js server that you saw in the first terminal. And so that server, is on the same computer, but it doesn't have to be. In Dave's case, he's actually running it on a computer that just acts as a server. And so yeah, then this is complete, and we see that. I can run other things while Dave's up here. keep him doing stuff. Let's see, app. What's another component that I should test, guys? Anim. And do them all? I can do that. Anim will take a while. Anim's pretty neat to see too because it shows the animations. I'm sorry? Oh yeah. Sorry. Cool. So there is the, animation. You can see some tablets are better than others at rendering some of this stuff. It's pretty neat to watch. So what's happening is that all this is getting served from your computer. So your computer is submitting these tests to a Yeti server that's somewhere else. And then these devices are connected, have a persistent connection to that Yeti server. And so what's really neat is that you can share these devices. They're all connected to, say, one hub, right, that one Yeti server. And then everyone on your team can then connect to this Yeti server, submitting tests to it, and can just use all these devices without any more setup. So as you can see, every time I finish running tests, all these are returning back to a page that then waits for more tests. So basically once that's done, I can continue and do more things. So I will test everything, I believe. Go crazy. So that'll take a long time. So so there's 1,078 HTML files in the library. And I'll switch over to that. And so this will take a while. This might take the rest of my talk. So I'll have this running in the background while I do the rest of my talk. But so this is pretty neat. Like you can do a lot with this. It still has a long way to go for getting through everything that we want to do with it. But as you can see, it's pretty capable. We can get, and you'll see when I return later in the talk to the results that come back from all these devices, you'll see all the results. And see it actually gives us really good information and you'll see quite a few test failures. This is actually running the absolute latest up-to-date YUI3 code on master. And so the big thing that I noticed was how we have a lot of we have a lot it's still running. You can see this here, and I'll switch back so you can see what this looks like as results come in. You see this at the bottom. You'll see this kind of bar that updates at the bottom. So that's telling you how fast the beats per second is pretty much every time that there is a function a test function or test method that either passes or fails. All its assertions. So this isn't counting assertions. It's counting each test method. And that can vary by framework. So I actually, later on in the talk, if someone reminds me, I'll run the jQuery test framework as well. And you can see that that's also doesn't quite correspond to assertions or whatever, so I call it beats. But it gives you an idea of how fast things are running. Right now, there's a lot of, there are a lot of tests here that might be slower or faster in different phases. So it gives you an idea of how quick things are rolling. So I talked about some of these things already. So sharing browsers and devices on your team. The other thing that I don't have that's kind of harder to demo, but it's still really neat, is that you can add more browsers. More of the same tablet means more of the same software means that you have your test will run faster if you split them up into separate HTML file kind of compartments for your tests to run in. So if you take advantage of that can be really useful. It works with Jenkins. So we actually, a few weeks ago, I did work for the first time to kind of get this integrated into our CI system, and it still has some issues that I want to work out. And so, but that is possible, and it does work. It works with QUnit. I mentioned I'm going to run jQuery later on if folks remind me. So and it works with YUI test. I've actually heard a lot of interest from folks that say hey, I use Jasmine. I don't, I want to add test framework X, and that's great, awesome. It's pretty easy to do that now, and I'm wanting to make it so that you don't even have to submit a pull request. It's just something that you can plug into Yeti. So you could just write, if you want to use a different code coverage instrumenter or whatever, you can do that. I release Yeti every week, unless I go on vacation or I'm doing YUIConf, so because it's just me right now. But that goes to the next point. There's a contributing document in the Yeti repository, and it's pretty clear. And right now, though, there's only 4 total contributors in the 3-year history of Yeti. And one was a one-line change by a guy, which I'm really thankful for. And another one was our intern, Clarence, and then Dave, and then me. So we could definitely use more help. If this excites you, then everything you need to do is in there, and I would love to have everyone work on this, and it's just fantastic. So So anyway, while this stuff runs, and right now, let's see, yeah, we're at the dawn test, and so this will take a while. So so you think about it though, whatever, you're not working on YUI perhaps, or you're not building, maybe doing this kind of level of testing, but if you're in this room, you're building something, you're building this stuff with code. What does that code do? Well, we're writing tests, but we want it to work. And so how does it work? Well, even though we have all these devices that are running our tests and most of them are passing, just because that's happening doesn't mean our code works. And you don't make your code work just by writing tests. And so testing really only helps you. Just because your code is tested doesn't mean it actually does what the people using your code expect it to do. That reminds me of this quote that is written long before I started programming, but it still holds true today. That no matter how much testing you do, no matter how sexy your test framework is, or how much the number of tests that run or how fast they run, the only thing you can be assured of is that it shows you that a bug exists. But if everything's green at the end of the day, that doesn't mean that you don't have bugs. And when you think about it, you get to define what bugs are, right? Like, if and that's kind of, when we, on YUI, we have all this documentation, we have API documentation, people file bugs when our documentation doesn't match up with people's expectations. But like testing really only gets you to kind of help you verify that, but it isn't the verification in of itself. Because you're ultimately defining what works, and then also testing can only show you that there's a problem with it, not that there is no problem at all. So it's a tool, but the goal is to have people use your code that is that aligns with their expectations of it. And so you should be focused on setting up that expectation, and also thinking about how testing works with that, and not kind of get into the trend of thinking like, oh my gosh, this is awesome that I can run all these tests, I can see that everything works. Or that everything is fine because all my tests are passing. Because you can actually write tests that are really terrible. And you can make your numbers look good. You can have a green dot on travesci.org. You can have 90%, 100% line coverage, but that isn't telling the whole story. So some quick anti-patterns. Just because you wrote toast first doesn't mean you have working code. Just because you have a lot of them doesn't mean your code works. And even 100% line coverage doesn't tell you the story for branches, for statements. It doesn't even tell you if, like I said before, if it's fulfilling what the expectations of, you could write something that has all the wrong tests, and or has tests that don't really help you find something when something goes wrong. But hey, this really does help. So you should be using Istanbul and Yogi to help you with getting code coverage. But you think about it, the big takeaway from this section is that you are not paid to write tests. And if you don't want to listen to me, you can listen to a really smart guy. And this really smart guy said this: I get paid for code that works, not for tests. So my philosophy is to test as little as possible to reach a given level of confidence. If I don't typically make a kind of mistake, like setting the wrong variables in a constructor, I don't test for it. When coding on a team, I modify my strategy to carefully test code that we collectively tend to get wrong. So this is written by a guy named Kent Beck, and you can be forgiven if you don't know who he is. But what's interesting about Kent Beck is he's been probably the guy most responsible for advancing the principle of test-driven development, which I was really surprised to read about and learn more about. This guy has talked a lot about the benefits of writing tests first. But then, you hear this from this guy, and he wrote this really great Stack Overflow comment a couple of years ago, but it's still gotten a lot of attention, a lot of views, even though this has been locked down. So there's no one keeps voting this up anymore. But I love the first comment that says, "The world does not think that Kent Beck would say this. There are legions of developers dutifully pursuing 100% coverage because they think is what Kent Beck would do. I have told many of you said," and he goes on, but that always here to test first as a religion. And that kind of goes into what we learned in about why not to use YUI, or rather when not to use YUI, when saying that you shouldn't look at any part of our project as a religion. And I think Ryan had a really good point when he was saying that. And I think that that's true. Like all this stuff is kind of used to showcase that this stuff is a tool, and like YUI is a tool that helps you get to what your users want, right? So is testing. So I would encourage you all to think about it that way. Kent was also one of the 17 original signatories of the Agile Manifesto, and I had to look that up because I keep hearing about Agile, and I wonder what that is. So if you're like me, you don't know what the heck I'm talking about. And so I think it's interesting when I went back and read it. And these guys got kind of all met in Utah in 2001, and they all came up with this statement, and they all agreed on. And so you could take it or leave it, but I think it's interesting to think about because we hear this all the time. So we are uncovering better ways of developing software by doing it and helping others do it. Through this work, we have come to value individuals and interactions over processes and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, and responding to change over following a plan. That is, while there is value on the items on the right, we value the items on the left more. So he's saying that all these things are important, or this group of people is saying all these things are kind of important, and some of these you might think don't apply or they're kind of enterprisey sounding, but I think when you think about it, especially the first 2 points, individuals and interactions over processes and tools, like you need process when you're dealing with a community this big, right? You need something that says like who gets to commit, who gets to review, who is going to review your pull request, but ultimately what's that for? It's for individuals and how they interact with our code, right? That's the purpose of that. And so there's value to both sides. There's value to comprehensive documentation because it lets people at scale kind of know like what the expectation and what your software will do. And so it's very, very important. It's very important that you speak that really clearly, but what's most important is that your code works, right? Instead of being in a meeting all day talking about it, instead of me standing up here all day and just talking about how awesome this is, I should be focusing on making this work really well. And that's what I hope to do. So to restate this simply, working software is better than comprehensive docs. Working software is better than just talking about it or even metrics about it, and that's where testing kind of comes in. And also just having green lights show up on your CI system does not mean that you have working software. So going back to the concept that you can do too much of this. Or even just introducing that, I suppose. You think about it, like I mentioned in the beginning of the talk, your time is very limited, right? So that's kind of the first thing that you can think of is that your time is limited, so you want to make the best use of the time you spend testing. So that's important. But then say you had all the time in the world to test, right? So if that isn't a problem, and you can just say, well, we're going to take half of our team and get 90, 100% line coverage, in the next month, and we're going to stop everything and do it. And you're going to do it right and everything. You could still take this too far because even if you do that, I would say that you're still missing out on things. But I think this can be illustrated better than an explanation that I can make, and I think it can relate to a lot of you. So who traveled here to YUIConf? A lot of you. How many of you traveled by plane, or traveled by plane at all this year? So you've probably dealt with how a popular government or infamous government organization deals with trying to verify that you're safe. And so they've done a lot of work in testing. And because what they're trying to do is make sure that you're safe, and that's a very important thing. I want to make sure that I'm safe when I'm traveling home to see my family. But the way that they've done this is kind of forgetting that when they find something, it shows that there is something. There was a threat. There was a knife. There was someone trying to get a bomb on a plane or what have you. But just because they found it doesn't mean, or just because they don't find something doesn't mean it's not there. And so they take this to a point where they do a lot and they find more and more. And it's kind of what encourages this feedback loop of doing more to detect and more to find things. But when you get to the point where you have folks being put through conditions that are harming the people who are meant to be traveling, you're starting to get to the point where you're not actually doing what you originally set out to do, right? You're getting to a point where you have folks who are now more inconvenienced by the process of making sure that they're safe than what they would have been if by maybe using a more reasonable approach. So we've all kind of experienced this, and so And this is something that I thought was explained really well on the signal versus noise blog on 37signals.com about how when you first discover test-driven development, you kind of get into feeling like you should be testing everything. And I don't think that's really, I think this really stood out to me when I read it, and is something that can really be used by folks to write better software when they think about it this way. Because whenever you're writing tests, just like whenever the TSA is implementing something new and how they verify the security for folks who are coming in and screening, that has a cost associated with it. It takes time, it's inconvenient, it adds more layers, and this is all things that you should be thinking about. So when we're talking about code, though, it takes time to write these tests, to update them whenever the code that's behind them changes, to read and understand this stuff, and it also takes time to actually run them. So, when you think about it, it's just kind of, even if you had all the time in the world to do this stuff, it's still something that would concern me because, this is probably time I would say that's even better spent kind of working on features that will make sure that your code works and delivering more for the people who use your code. So, 37 and the signal versus noise blog. They talk about David talks about quality theater, and so with things like that we started to care a lot about. And this is just things to think about. So total test count, line coverage, branch coverage, statement coverage, speed of test runs. But those are all great things, but we forgot that this stuff, there's a lot of it. There could be too much test code. It could be like right now, we still have browsers that are still running through our test suite. So we have great coverage, that's good. And I would say that this stuff is important considering how important YUI is, or the framework, and how the things that we should have in the core long term should be absolutely necessary and things in there. But when it takes a long time to write, I can make a tool that helps us get that tested faster. But ultimately, it might make more sense to us to have less code in our core and to have, and by nature of that, by extension, less tests that we have to run. And then high coverage by useless tests. So you can get 100% line coverage pretty simply, but still have the wrong kind of test. And so that's something to think about. So there's a quick checklist that you can take with you and fold in your pocket and take out next time you're writing code. So consider how much code you have to how much tests you have. If I don't know, I would think if code was 1 and test was 2, you're good. If it starts getting to 3, start or even higher than that, I would start caring a little bit more about it. Not that doesn't make sense, but that you should probably start looking into it more for why you're doing that in your app. You should also be testing the smallest possible thing first. And so I said this instead of saying how it was told to me when I first was learning from testing from people I thought were really smart. And that was that you should do unit tests first and then integration tests. But that's basically the plain English way to say it, is to test the smallest possible thing you can before moving on to things that work together. So so whether or not that winds up fitting into what your test framework of choice calls a unit test or not, that doesn't really matter. You should just try to test the smallest thing first, because the benefit you get from that is that whenever that test will fail later on, it will show you exactly where the failure is, and not just like this subsystem completely it failed somewhere, but you don't know where that failure is. So reserve the kinds of things that test subsystems or things that work together for the things that kind of test a whole bunch of moving parts together for after you get the smallest thing tested. And then if you're spending too much time writing tests, then like if you're spending more than a third or even half, I would say probably about half of your time writing tests for a feature or a bug fix or something, you may be doing something, you may be okay. Like that might be okay, but I would encourage you then to spend time and look at how other people have solved the problem that you're trying to solve to see if you could make that faster, right? Make that easier on yourself. There could be a tool out there that makes testing stuff a lot easier. So I would encourage you to look at that if you're spending too much time writing tests or doing a lot of boilerplate. Finding a way to make that easier will make your testing time overall much more effective. So consider the metrics that you don't see when you're running things in your test runner. Like you'll whenever you see how much tests you have and everything, that's great. But just consider that you're also spending a lot of time, not just writing them, but the time that it takes to run them and to understand them and update them later on. The other thing is we may have forgotten about our own productivity. In making tests more like a religion, or more like rather something that you adhere to at all costs, of putting that above all things, you can forget about why you do it, which I've talked about a little bit. But also, we almost forgot about what the benefits are for ourselves for not putting this up as this is the first and most important thing. So Kent Beck in his Stack Overflow answer went on to say a few things. Different people have different testing strategies based on this philosophy, but it seems reasonable to me, given the immature state of understanding how tests can best fit into the inner loop of coding. 10 or 20 years from now, we'll likely have a more universal theory of which tests to write, which tests not to write, and how to tell the difference. In the meantime, experimentation seems in order. So test-driven development is for experimenting. Just because that it's a good idea, it doesn't mean you should use it all the time. In fact, I actually spend most of the time when I do test-driven development, I'm doing that in response to fixing a bug, because that tends to make sense. It helps you understand the bug when you write the test, and now you know that it's not meeting expectations. But just kind of like how Agile is not just something fixed. It's just people kind of met up in a resort in Utah and they decided like these things are important, and a lot of people can agree with them. But that doesn't mean that you have to write software in a certain way to do it. So it isn't a kind of an experimental thing. And so is your creative process. So I would encourage you all to think about that when thinking about how to apply testing with your code, because you do it to make great code. So the question I get after all this when I've explained Yeti and show that off is, well, we have limited time, but we still want to test. So what should we test? And what order should we do it in? Should we stop everything and do it? It's a really good question to ask. So you should prioritize what you do, and that's because you can't do everything all at once. And nor do I think you should. I don't think it's wise for a team to stop doing everything just as the knee-jerk reaction to we don't have tests. Then obviously we must stop everything and write tests. Not necessarily, but if you are going to do that, or even if you don't, you should be thinking about what order you should do those things in. So, and I think a good question to ask for that is what code is changing the most. Because if code is changing quite a bit, but you don't have tests for it yet, it may not be. It depends on your application, but that could be a factor in what you decide to test first. Something that isn't kind of related to testing, but I thought would illustrate my next point better, is semantic versioning. And so when you think about like what code's changing, you can think about it as like how stable is this section of code, and how relied upon is it. And so this isn't really saying that you should use semantic versioning and that helps you, but rather it's kind of an interesting idea. If you just take away the human readable part of it and just think about when you look at version numbers, which is kind of this, but you look at the version numbers, you have X, Y, and Z. This lets you know that, like, if I look at this project, I could see that if this is all the releases it ever had. I could tell you that it was kind of experimental for some time, and then it became relied upon, and then they made a breaking change. But ultimately, like, depending on the time it took between these things, this gives me kind of an idea of how stable this project is, or how relied upon it is, or how fast it's changing. If I see the X number change too much over time, it could be that this is something that like people are keep breaking compatibility all the time, or they could be doing that over a period of years, which makes that more reasonable because software is always changing. But what we need for our task of testing your own project is something that isn't at the project level, but at the section level inside of your project. So we need a way for you to think about how to categorize each section of your code. So when I looked at that and kind of how to think about that, I looked at Node, and I saw that they did a really good job at this in their documentation, because every part of their documentation has this covered with something that they call the stability index, the Node.js stability index. And so it accomplishes that goal by doing this. And this is straight from their docs. Throughout the documentation, you will see indications of a section's stability. the Node.js API is still somewhat changing, and as it matures, certain parts are more reliable than others. Some are so proven and so relied upon that they are unlikely to ever change at all. Others are brand new and experimental, or known to be hazardous and in the process of being redesigned. So what this question that this answers that doesn't help you but helps people who use your code is, how reliable is this? Because really, even though you can use something like Simver or even just well-written documentation that gives, or a blog post or whatever that give people the right, or readmes or what have you, that give people the right expectations for how stable your code is, I think that it also makes sense for you to do that at a section level and to tell people at each section. So when you make that public, it gives you an idea, it gives other people an idea of how reliable your software is. But for you, what that gives you is, if you stop and take a look at all of your code, it helps you prioritize how you write your tests. Because if this is what Node.js uses, and you can invent your own labels, but I thought they were pretty good. So deprecated code is code that you shouldn't bother writing tests for at all, because the code's about to go away. Whereas locked it's so important that there's no change to this is even planned. API frozen means like none without good reason, and so on. You can I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but you can read more about that at the Node.js website and check that out. So I think it's really useful for you to find out and take a good look at what your where things are moving quickly in your code, and come up with what's more important and maybe what deserves more test coverage when you're starting from scratch. So if you don't do that, then you're kind of liable then to go and look at, maybe write tests for things that you just most recently wrote, and that may not be where you get the most benefit, right? If you're working with experimental or writing tests for experimental stuff, when you have poor coverage and the stable or API frozen kind of stuff that's more relied upon, you may not be using your time as wisely as you can. And like I said, your time is limited. So going back to Kent Beck, and thinking about what to test, what matters, his philosophy is to test as little as possible to reach a given level of confidence. And so that's kind of the takeaway, is you want to use testing, but you want it just enough that gives you the confidence level that you need. And if you don't make a kind of mistake, then he doesn't test for it. But this is important. When he's on a team, he doesn't do that anymore. He said he modifies that strategy to carefully test code that, as a collective, they tend to get wrong. And so that's something too that you can kind of take away is when you're thinking about what kind of tests to write. If you see people constantly making the same kind of mistake, that's something you probably want to write tests for. So I'm going to now return back to the Dave Glass Device Laboratory of Southern Illinois, which is now visiting here, and check out how we're doing. So let's take a look. So still running, but we had quite a few failures. So if I can scroll up here. So this gives you just an idea that we don't normally test on this many devices. And this is testing with everything and on our latest code. So some of the stuff that we have are failures that are some of these are things that we look at this kind of thing for scroll info, and it's on the default Android browser, not Chrome, but the default one, and that's kind of going away too. So you think about this is not something we should be focusing on when thinking about what my priorities should be, because we have a lot of these failures. You could see that there's a lot of things that aren't working, but some of these things are kind of caused by things that we may not want to fix. So we have this failure here, or rather there's another one that was on Safari 17 where it's failing on a lot of different kinds of tests, but that isn't something that we might just run this and then understand that Firefox 17 isn't really well behaved, but it's good for us to understand that and for us to know about these kinds of things. So anyway, everything is finished except for this ASUS. Well, now it's finished, so I can return back to it and get a result at the end. Yeah, there we go. So in 28 minutes, 35 seconds, we've tested 38,137 tests. So I think that's pretty cool. And we only had 207 of those fail. So I think that's pretty neat. Yeah, thank you. So for fun, I'm going to run jQuery to finish things out. So cool. Oh, yeah. Thank you, Dave. So let's go back to the... So this is the jQuery test suite. So something to keep in mind, too, if you decide to use Yeti is how it has Yeti, or YUI, Yeti was kind of made for YUI, and how we decided to use HTML files that were pretty small, and we wanted to break those out into HTML files that were small so that folks didn't have to use Yeti. They could just double-click on a file, it would automatically run and show if the tests are working or not. They didn't need to use install node or anything else. And so if someone wanted to commit or contribute a fix, they didn't have to install any tools. They just kind of could use whatever browser they had. So we decided to do that, and that kind of pays off for us because the smallest unit is kind of an HTML file, and that can be spread out to all these different machines pretty well. But jQuery doesn't have that, and so they have one test file. But what they can do is there's a drop-down menu on each thing that lets you select just to run a subset. But by default, it runs everything, and that's what we're seeing here. So if I go back real quick to show what this looks like, so some of these timed out, but it's running at about 117 for npm. It's yeah, I'm done. So but for QUnit, it's assertions and not test methods. So if you're wanting to get started on this, you can go to yeti.cx, and it's basically just a tool that helps you build working code. But your code is ultimately up to you. So all this stuff is opinion, right? It's opinion that I've found by talking with people that know what they're doing. But the whole goal of this talk is kind of to show you that you should take this and then find out how testing can work to make your code work for the people that care about it, the people who actually use it. And I think a user focus, instead of a focus on what the best or coolest way to get great metrics that make ourselves feel better, is always the right kind of decision. So, like Kent Beck says, experimentation seems to be in order until we find the right way to write tests. And so I'd encourage you to all to experiment. And if you're curious about where this talk came from, it came from a blog post on my website, which you can check out by going to Lanyard. So everyone, go experiment, and thank you so much. I'm at Reid on Twitter, Twitter, app.net, and GitHub and IRC. So I hope to talk with you guys afterward, and thanks so much. So.
Any questions for Reid?
So a long time ago, in the dawn of time, a year ago, I remember Yeti had this capacity for similar to a test framework I totally forget, but it was the red-green one where it would just watch your file system and run the tests as files changed and give you that output. Has that kind of shifted away from that? You're not really...
Run tests as files change?
Yeah.
So it never has done that, but I think I was talking about that with other folks. It would be really interesting to add. So yeah, just having it in a separate tab and then seeing the results as you change the file would be really cool. So yeah, I'd love help. Most of the things that I'm working on for the next few weeks are to help us get, or to help YUI get all the tests that we run right now that we publish on yui.github.com. Whenever folks make changes or commit code, that's now going to a public list, right? So what we're hoping to do is for those tests right now, for all those to use Yeti. And so that's where a lot of my focus is, but I've heard a lot of folks who asked for things like this, like the watch or having more test frameworks added. I've done a lot of work to make that easier for people to kind of get introduced to the Yeti code with the contributing file and with some of the rework I've done with collecting test results in the page. So I would love for people to help out with that if they'd like to see it sooner than I can do it. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Reid.
Thanks.